and political. Because a lot of times our work as archivists is often, and a lot of us are focused on creating empowering and participatory models of doing archival work. And this process of creating archival methods that are more alternative is sometimes done while we navigate around or through the institutional structures that we're working within, or outside of them completely. So our panelists today are going to speak on some of these issues. And first we're going to hear from Caroline Heal, who will discuss her experiences working with the independent media organization Third World Newsreel. Then we're going to hear from Skyla Hearn, who's the archivist and special collections librarian at the DuSable Museum of African American History and has done a lot of community archival work in the Chicago area. Then we'll hear from Kelly Hayden, who's an archivist at Bay Area Video Coalition. And then finally we're going to have a community conversation with Keith Wilson, who will talk about his work organizing with the People's Archive of Police Violence in Cleveland, Ohio. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Caroline.
Thank you. I'm so nervous. I apologize if I ramble. I want to preface my presentation by thanking and acknowledging Molly Fair for inviting me to speak at this panel, and also to my co-speakers, whose work I admire a lot, and to AMIA for providing a forum for these conversations to happen. I also want to give a special shout out to JP Takagi, Rosalie Torres, and Frank Tan, who work at Third World Newsreel, for allowing me to work with them. My talk will briefly discuss the genesis and historical relevance of Third World Newsreel, a US-based radical media collective that was born in the late 1960s, and the efforts taken thus far to preserve their archival collections. This talk will also attempt to touch upon the concessions made by nonprofits in the development of an archival policy, and my fluctuating, changing approach in working with this collection. So a little bit of history, an early incarnation of Third World Newsreel, the newsreel. Their first meeting took place in December 67 at the Filmmaker Cinematheque. And it included members from the non-fiction film circles such as Robert Kramer, Robin Markler, Norman Fruchter, Anna Siegel, Ross Payne, Beth Brandt, Amigo, Deborah Schaefer. And that first configuration of the group was conceived to pull in resources or footage from demonstrations occurring throughout major cities in the US. Jonas Mikas was kind of like a floater around those circles in the Village Voice, describes the group as a radical news service whose purpose is to provide an alternative to the limited and biased coverage of television news. That first incarnation, the newsreel documented the activities and organizing and public demonstrations of groups such as the Students for the Democratic Society, SDS, the Black Panthers, the Young Lords, Vietnam veterans, Waters' rights groups, anti-war groups, anarchist groups, women's rights groups, and liberation or decolonization movements. At around 72, 73, a fraction of newsreel members started reevaluating its internal structure, because at that time the organization was dominated by white men, and all of the available funding was channeled to those empowered. And so as a reaction, the newsreel created several caucuses, including one called One for Third World People, that created tensions And so the group split and was transformed into third world newsreel. During that period where it is third world newsreel, people of color gained more authority in the collective, and the collective was managed for the first time in its existence by women and continues to do so. It has been administered by Christine Choi, Susan Dobson, Pearl Bowser, Adelaide Griffin, pretty major people in film circles, or non-fiction film circles. That period, or really the whole period, or its incarnation as third world newsreel, is quite prolific because they expanded their distribution network to include not only the films that they produce, but films made in Cuba, in Vietnam, in Chile, all over the world, in North Africa, Algiers, Palestine, etc., etc. They also set up an exhibition space called the Higher Ground, and included into their mission an annual filmmaking workshop catered to people of color. And their mission, as it stands and as of today, is to foster the creation and appreciation and dissemination of independent film and video by and about people of color and social justice issues. So onto my work with third world newsreel, took on the shape of a survey, which took about 5 months. I did this as part of my AMIA thesis, and I wanted to gather as much data as possible on previous efforts made to preserve their media collections with the goal to produce a report detailing those previous efforts and kind of recommend what an achievable proactive methodology towards an active care of their collections. Because third world newsreel at this moment is a non-profit with a staff of 3, and they cannot afford to employ a full-time archivist, preservation actions have occurred at intervals. The organization has often relied on its own self on top of other responsibilities. Interns coming in from archiving programs such as AMIA, and willing persons that care enough about the collection to lend a helping hand. So for example, in 2013, the collective activist archivists, a group of audiovisual preservationists, established or began to work with Overall Newsreel. They built a shelving unit in one of the storage facilities and created an item-level inventory based on a basic visual assessment of their 16mm film collections. Archivist member Kelly Hayden built a FileMaker database to catalog their films. Also earlier this year, NYU hosted a symposium that paired their preserved films with contemporary social justice struggles, and which also included an archiving workshop led by the Transfer Collective. And so my own work was, what I used to guide my own work was an inspection exercise of their 16mm film collection. And I started that exercise with the hopes that that film inspection would shed some light on the condition and arrangement of the items that third world newsreel stored. And what I found from that inspection wasn't surprising. Really, screens were burned down and cans were mislabeled. And I was working at a storage facility, like a commercial storage facility, and space was tight and kind of like shuffling everything around. Was time consuming and honestly very frustrating. So I did you learn something from that inspection exercise? Yeah. So I had to kind of rework that my approach. Like I thought I would, be able to inspect thousands of films, like I've been taught in my program. So I would just give them like a detailed inspection sheet with all of the metadata and whatever, and that wasn't really feasible because there was no space, and they really didn't need that. So in conversation with Tito, Third Newsreel staff, we started talking about developing an archival policy that could be integrated into their mission statement, which does not or did not include an archival statement. So yeah, it was through those conversations that we were all able to organize a set of institutional goals, which included the specific objective to collect and manage the work of Newsreel and Third Newsreel, and a short medium-term or medium-term goal to create a unified database for all of their collections, which are dispersed throughout 3 different storage locations, and really determining what items in the collection were most at risk or were of higher priority. So yeah, I mean, at this point I tried to get access to their videotape collections, and I found that they were kind of, I mean, I don't know if this is myself coming in and being critical of myself, but I thought that they didn't at first trust me enough to give me access to their videotape collections. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know, what you were saying earlier, introducing this talk, I mean, I think I had to prove myself to them. And yeah, I mean, again, to say that I had these expectations kind of created from my archival program where I would just, come in and be, super cool and give them, like the greatest, and discover like a super obscure film and, give my awesome great presentation about it. And I had to kind of like be malleable in my approach and adjust my expectations, especially in working with a non-traditional archive where, I had to tone it down with the archival talk with them, and yeah. I don't know if that was a little bit rambly, but I'm gonna stop there. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Skyla Hearn, and I am the archivist and special collections librarian at the DuSable Museum of African American History in Chicago. I've entitled this presentation, What Happens Here, because I think that it's important when we're talking about community archives to consider the folks that these materials represent and the areas in which they've been created, and to also give honor to those spaces that often change for various reasons. And what we're seeing in a lot of communities across the country is that folks are losing their autonomy based on issues such as gentrification and so on. And so I just really think that it's important that, I think most of us are thinking this way anyway, from meeting some of you. And just from hearing what's been going on, that we're considering the creators and from a first-person perspective and not necessarily wanting to represent them, but to have their voices included. So it's kind of, thinking like, well, what happens here stays here. And so the 3 institutions that I decided to discuss with you that I've worked with in Chicago are the DuSable Museum, of course, the Southside Community Arts Center, and this other archive called Never the Same. And now it's the other component, the archival component is Never the Same Chicago Ephemera Archive. And so just a little bit of background. I've been working at various Chicago institutions for, I think, like close to 10 years. I looked at the date and I was like, wow, I've been doing this stuff for a long time. And I think it kind of started at home, looking at my grandmother's photo albums. And, I'm pretty sure most of you are probably familiar, like with those super old photo albums that you have to peel off the sticky page and they're just falling apart. And I was just like, how fortunate I am to be able to live my own history through my grandmother who just turned 91 a couple of days ago, right? And so I think about other people who too are living in their communities, who are also living their histories, but who may not be at, or have the advantage, so to speak, of having those histories recorded and preserved. So the DuSable Museum, this first one here, is where it actually began. And I'm sorry I don't have a picture of her, but Dr. Margaret Burroughs is the founder of the DuSable Museum. And it began in her home. She and her husband saw the need to fill in a void for people in the area called Bronzeville in Chicago, which is a historic area. It was the first site for the Great Migration for African Americans who came to this area. So she and her husband decided to start this museum in their home, and it was initially called the Ebony Museum. And the building in the middle is the Southside Community Arts Center. She's actually one of the co-founders of that as well. The Southside Community Arts Center actually started first, and she was around 17 or something like that, collecting dimes to help to establish the space. Because again, at this time, African Americans really didn't have a space where they could come together as artists to work, to critique each other's work, etc. At this time, she was a student at the Art Institute, and along with a few other students, they were able to get together and offer these educational services to the youth in the community, as well as Chicago, like around the city, here in this space. So I'm just giving you like a quick history, to move you through. And then this last collection of materials on this piece of cloth is representative of what we at Never the Same called an unfurling. So within this particular collection, which is based on social and politically engaged art ephemera, folks are invited to come into the archive and select pieces and then attribute meaning to those pieces and have a conversation with the audience and about what this means. And so these 3 particular organizations were passion projects, but of course, work for me, but I was very much so involved and loved the work that I did with them. And so thinking about community archiving, most of the work that I've done has been for and with larger institutions. I have also worked with individuals in small institutions. And in this case, just thinking about community archiving, I think about the materials being representative, of course, of the communities and working with the people in the communities. But I also think about the tension that exists for the most part with the larger institutions that are helping to fund this project work with the smaller institutions. And so this example that I have here is very much so an aspect of community archiving, but it was supported through the University of Chicago with various institutions that the Black Metropolis Research Consortium referred to as second spaces. And the reason that they refer to them as second spaces is because these particular institutions remained in the communities that they were created in. And so, these institutions maintained their autonomy, but what the University of Chicago was able to do was to create this tool which linked all of them so that folks would know where they could find these collections throughout Chicago and the Chicagoland area. The DuSable Museum also participated in this project. And so on the other end of it, thinking about community archiving, just thinking in terms of, being an activist archivist and actually taking it to the streets, right? So we're all familiar with Ferguson and Black Lives Matter. In Chicago, we have this movement initiative that's happening right now called Freedom Square, which is in Holman Square. And so what's happened is that this particular area wasn't marked by the police, but they were taking folks there. And so the community found out about it. And, just thinking in terms of these processes, right? And thinking about the structure of the state and how we're living right now and how human beings are being treated. So this group, Let Us Breathe, has occupied this space in protest of what's happening to these prisoners, which are being taken to this unmarked space, right? And so what's really interesting is how it's taken off over the last couple of months. There are whole families that sit there that, occupy the space in protest of what's happening. And so I just think about documenting these stories, right? And working with people to make sure that they're actually documenting what's happening. Because oftentimes activists, aren't really thinking about documenting in current time, right? And we need to know, we need proof of what's happening. Especially for our youth for the future. And then just thinking about, relationships and what I was thinking about the summary for our talk and, just that aspect of, I think, sometimes we just think that it's easy in a sense to go and talk. Well, I do. Maybe it's because I feel like I'm not a stranger to anyone, like in embodying, I guess, like that level of familiarity, and just thinking to myself, oh, well, I'm just going to drum up a conversation and we're going to talk archives and they're going to understand how important it is, to conserve all this stuff. And I have to tell you, I chose these three people, these three people or folks who represent these collections intentionally because those were some hard times, okay? Like the elder in the middle, Baba Phil Quran, as we refer to him as, was one of the founding members of Sun Ra, like back in the day, right? And I credit him with being one of the fathers of Afrofuturism, through music and other things. He's still alive. He's close to 100. He gave me a really hard time. I cried tears, like not dry cry, like real tears. It was just really hard to work with him. But even still to this day, although I wasn't successful, I still stress to him and some of his sons how important it is for his legacy to be preserved because he's made amazing contributions to our society. And then the older woman in the other photo, is credited with beginning this African dance troupe at one of our city colleges in Chicago called Malcolm X College. And she created these amazing costumes and all this choreography for like a period of, I think, 30 years. And she's like, my stuff, it's just junk. And I'm like, no, it's not. You have to save it. you know, and it's not always, you know, the easiest thing to do. And then the photograph of Coretta Scott King, it belongs to Robert Sengstack, who is the son of one of the founders of the Chicago Defender. And he has an immense amount of photographs, negatives, you know, and being in conversation with him, again, you know, it's not, it's not easy, you know, I'm flexible, you know, so if the conversation has to take place over me driving him to the grocery store, then that's how I'm gonna have that conversation, right? And I mean, like, he also is elderly at this point, so I really don't mind taking him to the grocery store, but at the end, I'm like, okay, so, you know, maybe your collection may not come to my institution, which is fine, but then thinking in terms of personal archiving, you know, what is happening on your end, you know, whereby these materials are being taken care of, and how can I help you do that? I firmly believe in meeting people where they are, you know, and that doesn't always mean that, you know, the conversation has to take place around, you know, ingesting or safekeeping at a larger institution if they're more comfortable keeping their things for themselves, right? And I think that we definitely need to also honor that. I haven't referred to my notes much. Hopefully I'm not leaving much out. And then advocacy. I think it's very important that, you know, we advocate for ourselves as archivists, because, you know, it's sometimes challenging, you know, like referring back to our description, you know, working in an institution which sometimes, and not necessarily just with the DuSable, but, you know, I've experienced this elsewhere. A year and a half ago or so, I was a visiting instructor and resident archivist for social justice. That's a title, like a really bad title. That meant 2 jobs, 2 supervisors, 3 offices, and 1 salary. And, you know, it's hard, you know, and it's really interesting because, you know, oftentimes we all use the same jargon, but what I realized is that the definitions, you know, the meanings, they often don't pair up with how you understand these words to me, right? And so, like, the struggle is sometimes internal as well as, you know, like I just mentioned with some of the creators, you know, and so just trying to really carve out a space for yourself as an archivist to be able to be comfortable to advocate for the work that you yourself do, but then also to be able to advocate for the collections that you represent within your respective repositories. And so, you know, I've worked like in terms of collaborations with other community organizations, private donors, and so forth here. And the examples that I pulled for you, at the top again is a photo of the Southside Community Arts Center. And we were able to have a very positive collaboration with the University of Chicago. And what this entailed was the Southside Community Arts Center maintaining their own permanent collection of artwork, which is still housed within their space, within the neighborhood, and, you know, surrounded by the community members who created these artworks and such. But what the University of Chicago has offered is this wonderful tool through their Visual Resource Center called Luna, whereby you can access these approximately like 300 pieces through Luna, so that folks can use them for research and so forth. You know, and I think that I thought it was a great relationship, and I still do, because of the fact that, you know, folks are able to access these materials, right, that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do. And the Art Center, you know, they don't have a lot of money. They're the only one of their kind left. They've been around for 70+ years. And, you know, myself, along with a couple of other archivists, provide our time and skills, you know, pro bono with them. This particular project, I was actually paid, again, with that collaboration with the University of Chicago. But still, you know, they're able to provide access to their materials, which is really great when, in fact, they may not be able to house people in-house for research purposes. And then next to it, we have Dr. Jackie Goldsby, who started this project, Mapping the Stacks. And again, at that time, she also was with the University of Chicago. But what she was able to do, like the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, was to provide a link to either repositories that were solely African American material based or had a large collection of African American materials throughout the city of Chicago. And she worked with, for the most part, history PhD candidates to get that work done. And they did an amazing job. And then that's me in the corner, about 6 months pregnant, giving a presentation at Oakton Community College, which is one of our, in Des Plaines, which is right outside of Chicago, again, stressing to the students the importance of, well, one, understanding their history, the collective history, right? I think that it's important, of course, to honor our histories in terms of like ethnic identity is very important, that we understand, you know, African American history, et cetera, as they exist, definitely, but also to consider that, you know, our histories, our collective history, right? Our stories are a part of an overarching history, right? So that's what this is. And then outreach, just thinking about supporting these collections and how it can be done. And a couple of examples here are just using the collections themselves to speak to the communities. Because I think oftentimes people don't know the treasures that they have amongst themselves, you know. And for the ones who do, you know, in some cases, I don't know, I guess the point that I'm making is just that sometimes the word just doesn't get out. And I think that it's important to activate these collections whenever we can. And these particular examples were activated through the Southside Community Arts Center. But moving currently in the work that I do at the DuSable Museum, I've been holding archival workshops, which are not like the workshop that we discussed this morning necessarily, because more of the focus is on, I guess, like more of an analog approach, because there are a lot of elderly people in the community that have materials, so, and they don't necessarily come in. We have this one elderly woman that did come in and she scared the crap out of me because she had a car accident on her way. And I was like, please don't do it again, I'll come you, you know. But I mean, she brought in like this box of amazing materials, right? And I'm glad that she made it in safely with those materials. And so just offering this service to folks, you know, helping them, because a lot of people, that's the other thing, I don't want to discredit what people are doing and saying, you know, I can do this for you, but how can I help you further along with your process, right? And for those who don't necessarily have a process in place, then, you know, I want to be able to introduce methods that I think that they can maintain, or maybe someone in their family or a close friend can help them with, right? I don't want to assume, again, that, you know, because folks aren't professionals, like, you know, me, that they don't know what they're doing, because a lot of people really are aware of what to do. They just may not necessarily have the resources. And then so far as like the education component, again, working at DuSable and other spaces, I've been able to work the archives into history forums. We have a few local history forums in Chicago. One in particular, I'm working with a group now of retired historians who definitely have put me to work. And just really trying to help them to develop the area of artworks. Because for the most part, I've worked a lot with artists and their artwork, or not necessarily like politics, etc. And then, you know, being flexible enough to be a roving archivist. Again, going back to the idea of meeting people, you know, meeting the need where it is, because people can't always come to you. And then also, I don't think the assumption should be that they should. You know, we need to reach out to the community, you know, because oftentimes I hear, well, you know, we didn't know because they didn't come over here. Well, what's wrong with your legs or your fingers, right? Like, make a phone call, you know, walk across the street, say hello. Like, that's how the conversation begins. Okay. And so these other examples here. And then sustainability, I think, yay, okay, not yay, but I got 2 minutes and I'm on my last slide, so it actually worked out. But anywho, you see it. Sustainability. So think about, how you're developing the project or the program, and then what happens afterwards. When you remove your body, your ideas, how will it continue? And then also, I think it's important to make sure that the folks in the community can continue it itself. Because whatever systems you put in place, I definitely think that they should be usable and accessible, right, by all. And I don't think that that threatens our position as archivists. I think it strengthens what we do, right? And it also empowers people, right, so that then they can take the message and carry it forward. So thank you.
Everyone, just as a reminder, if you're on the AMIA listserv, you should have a link to our collaborative note-taking, which I believe Erwin is working on. You are, right? Okay, so thank you so much for participating in the Do-It-Yourself and Community Archiving Symposium. As I mentioned earlier today, this is the first time in the history of the AMIA conference the entire day of sessions and screenings is open to the public. I'm very, very humbled to be on a panel with such inspiring and purpose-driven thinkers. And I also really want to thank Molly Farrer for conceiving and organizing a panel that gives us the opportunity to talk freely to our peers about the challenges of trying to reconcile archival dogma within the culture of community archives. So you may have noticed that I took down the PowerPoint. For me, this symposium has been something akin to the Catholic holiday of Lent, an occasion to act without privilege, crutch, or advice, in solidarity with those who have suffered much greater indignities for much worthier causes. This is the first time I've ever spoken at length to an audience without a list of bullet points behind me, so we'll see how it goes. But the text of this speech, as well as the presentations of many of our speakers today, will be available online. We aren't sure where yet, so if you're not on the AMIA listserv, please add your email to that list on the table in the back there, and we'll be sure to let you know when it's ready. But if I did have a presentation, my first slide would show the title of my talk, which is "One has the moral responsibility to disobey unjust best practices," humbly evoking the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, who wrote from jail in Birmingham in 1963, "One has the moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws." Now, on Tuesday, I was feeling very sheepish and foolhardy to equate the follies of archival best practices with the true injustices experienced by our most revered civil rights leader. To do so felt at best hyperbolic, at worst glib, and I was close to removing it altogether. Then came Wednesday morning, and I don't feel sheepish or foolhardy or hyperbolic anymore because the comparison is no longer extreme. I believe that we as archivists have a role to play in what I suspect will be a galvanized and united social justice movement, and we can't let unattainable best practices get in the way. Now, what fuels social justice effort is momentum, something that we have right now. Harnessing that momentum, keeping it moving at a steady, productive pace is the Herculean task that organizers must master. But it's at odds with traditional archival discourses where time is an ocean and access is the final step to a preservation workflow. Now, I've spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to define community archive, and it's surprisingly hard to do. Many attempts to separate a community archive from those whose fates are secured by institutional resources end up sending an inaccurate message that professional archivists are not doing their part to engage communities and acquire content from the peripheries. In fact, community archiving models can be really beneficial to special collections that live on the strength of their volunteers and that prevail despite the lack of financial investment on the part of their institutional administrators. It was really only when I stopped thinking in terms of money and resources that patterns begin to emerge. And two of them stand out. Number one, in community archives, momentum is a resource. People power and interest in the collection will rise and fall with what is happening in their communities. Number two, in community archives, the best interest of the community is priority to the best interest of the collection. Access, public or private, is prioritized or given equal importance to preservation. And when professionals get together and determine best practices, they generally disregard these two conditions. And I want to be clear that not all best practices are, shall we say, unjust. They are, at their very best, a framework or a set of guidelines that is people-based, open to modification, and adaptable. For example, the Society of American Archivists has a guide called Best Practices for Volunteers in Archives, and it is essential reading for community archives wishing to harness the strength of their mission supporters in an ethical way. At worst, best practices are rigid standards that are technically and financially insurmountable for many institutional archives to implement, not to mention those that are volunteer-run and living in the basement of an old bookstore, as the Radical Archives of Philadelphia once did. They are unnecessarily complicated and can confuse the relationship between the organization and a well-meaning professional archivist. In other words, they can cause more problems than they solve. And yet, time and again, archivists working with community collections, especially those who are just in or just out of school, are attempting to follow best practices, getting frustrated by the lack of resources and the pushback from the organization's unwillingness to invest in them. They end up drastically modifying their approaches anyway, burning out in the process, leaving the organization with little more than a spreadsheet and some tips. Now, how do I know this? I admit I am projecting a little bit. This soapbox that I stand upon is adapted from my thesis in school, where I synthesized my work with social justice archives. I've been working with them since 2011 when I co-founded Activist Archivist. My first encounter was with Equality Now, which aims to end female genital mutilation. Then with Occupy Wall Street Archives Working Group, and finally with Third World Newsreel, an organization that supports and distributes media by and about people of color. Since 2014, I've been with the Bay Area Video Coalition, the nonprofit organization that also operates under severe resource limitations, all the while seeking to provide media collectors with opportunities to preserve and digitize their work. Now, I'm just telling you all of this to give you some context about where I'm coming from regarding best practices. And I hope I'm not sending a message that they are not well-intentioned or developed by smart, hardworking people who have dedicated their careers to researching best methods for preserving technically complex media. But they are often developed in a vacuum of authority and resources, a privilege, if you will. Best practices is a misnomer. These are ideal practices, unjust when their implementation stalls the community archive's ability to maintain momentum. So what is the best practice? It's a kind of catch-all term. It can refer to any kind of technique that has shown to elicit superior results from another. This technique, protocol, procedure is often published in some form of writing that is widely distributed and referenced. In order for a best practice to be useful in a community archive, it must be adaptable. For example, it is a best practice to capture time code when digitizing an analog tape. This is not adaptable. You can either capture time code if you have the right connector, software, and training, or you cannot. It is a best practice to use metadata standards to guide the development of your catalog. Most metadata standards are adaptable, although I should stress that few come with accessible training materials that are readily understood by professionals. I'm a professional archivist, and I don't understand WCOR's website at all. An unjust best practice is one that cannot reasonably be implemented or managed without staff or resources. An unjust best practice discourages the collection from evolving into an archive that can be accessed, especially when momentum is hot and community archivists need to act. Most best practices for digital storage are unsustainable in community archives. Even if there is some money for setting up a system of backup and geographical dispersion, there is unlikely secure funding stream for that system to scale as the collection grows. Now, I have several ideas for how moving image archivists might approach with all this, a community archive with all of this in mind. One will be unpopular, but that is to prioritize access. You hear all the time in archive school that access is not preservation. But if done with thoughtfulness and care, there's no reason why access can't be a kind of preservation. Access is also the driving force behind momentum. When members of the community can see and use archival materials, they want to help. They want to be a part of the effort. And we need them to help. We need them to help catalog and put up shelves and do intake. And when they see the work that they have archived as being used and repurposed, it motivates and inspires them, and they'll continue. My other proposal is to organize and communicate recommendations for the archive in phases, with the first phase being actions the archive can take now. If you're going to recommend that an archive build a 16 terabyte RAID 5 to house their digital files, give them a place to start with the resources they have. Can hard drives be donated? Is internet archiving an option? And finally, I encourage you to fight your insecurities and not be afraid to ask questions. We've been hearing about this a lot at this conference, and thank God, because quite frankly, the reason I have such an aversion to best practices is that they give a certain strain of archivists, usually, but not always, a white man who has been working in the field a very long time, a license to intimidate. This type of person hoards the knowledge he or she has acquired and only reveals it to assert their authority on the subject. And there's something I hear over and over again, and maybe you've said it, I know I've said it. I don't want to ask a question to an archival community. I'm afraid to reveal what I'm doing in my archive, because if I am wrong, I will be shamed. But to effectively help our communities, we cannot be afraid of this person. If he or she is the only one with the knowledge you seek, feel the fear and ask anyway. Otherwise, as long as you're connecting with other archivists, acquiring, organizing, and disseminating knowledge, making good use of the resources that the community has, and serving the mission first and foremost, then you will make wise decisions that come from a thoughtful and a measured place, and not one of frustration and exhaustion. Now, just know that I know that you have nothing to apologize for. You have nothing to hide. Excuse me. From the claiming tech session we had the other day to our amazing plenary, the call to fight our inhibitions has been a frequent topic at this conference. But I need to hear it again, and maybe you do too. This is the Do-It-Yourself Community Archiving Symposium. This is a safe space. Let's figure out how we can build models and materials that help communities seize momentum and build active living archives. To end this with another quote by an inspiring figure, our field open source champion, friend to many, David Rice, who covered this subject much more succinctly than I ever could with a single phrase. Best practices are lame, follow your heart.
Hi, my name is... I'll just introduce myself. My name is Keith Wilson. I'm an activist from Cleveland. And a year and a half ago, my activist group put together a tribunal where community members from Cleveland were invited to come in and share their stories about police brutality and their interactions with police in and around Cleveland. And we also got some stories about experiences in prison. And so after we did this project, a few months later, the American, well, there was an archivist convention in Cleveland, and I'm not sure which one. And Jared and Greg from Princeton approached us to help put together an archive, not just for the tribunal, but also continuing to gather more stories in the future. And while they were there, while these archivists were there, they teamed up with us, and we actually went out into the community to gather more stories just from passersby. And so those stories are also on this archive. media from protests against police brutality that happened in Cleveland to document the efforts to fight it. So that happened in August of last year, and we more or less had an AMIA site set up a year ago, and we decided we didn't like the look of it that much. So we thought we could get something like this set up in about 3 weeks, but it's taken a year. And we're in a beta right now, and it's been in a beta for almost 2 weeks, and I've gotten no feedback yet. So a lot of the things that I've heard in the first 3 presentations ring true. Certainly we lost momentum. We had the momentum last year when we first set up, and we hired 3 web developers who had experience with AMIA to put this together. And somehow they thought that it could be done in 3 weeks, but that was wrong. And then we lost momentum. We lost one of our lead developer. Not loud enough. Should I come closer? We lost our lead developer in January, and then so it's just been kind of a slog. But I'm pretty happy with how it looks now. Another thing that was brought up was difficulty with getting people to understand the jargon. And you'll see that we have all items over here on the left. So we had quite a bit of discussion over this. The activists were like, why do we need this at all? Because we have these collections which are much better organized, and people want, and we also have the search box. If people want to search for something, they can always find the items that they want. But the people who are more involved with the archivist community were like, well, the items are the meat. That's like the most important thing. It has to go first. So as you see, it is first, and the activists wanted it to go at the end because people coming here don't even really know what items are. We used to have exhibits up there, and I've had to explain to the activists myself what exhibits are several times. And so we ended up taking that out since we haven't actually curated any exhibits anyway. So those were sort of an outline of what I've done and some of the difficulties that we've had. And I've kind of been busy this week. I didn't prepare a presentation, but I thought maybe I could just be a resource to answer questions if you have anything about this. Maybe Molly, you just want to lead that.
Yeah, so I just had a question to kick it off. Like, what was the process like talking to people and kind of approaching me and asking them to share their stories in the first place? Was there hesitation or, to kind of, because obviously it's a very emotional topic, and, what did people have concerns about security issues and that sort of thing?
I wasn't there,
Okay.
but I do know some of the answer to that anyway. Which is that, yes, there were some people who shared their stories, but they didn't want to report it. And supposedly, from the people who were there, those were some of the most interesting stories. They were told to avoid using any names of officers or even the name of which police force they were with for legal reasons. And a couple of people failed to do that. So we had to deal with that. So yeah, there was hesitation, but I was actually surprised with how many stories there were. I mean, there were about 40, and I didn't think that people would just walk by a table of outsiders and share these stories, but they did.
And is that process ongoing to kind of continue doing that interview process, or was it kind of a one-time?
Well, we were excited about doing that again.
Yeah.
And when we thought that we would have this up and ready at the beginning of the year, we were talking about, using the things we know how to do as activists, which is go out to the communities and spread the word, and hopefully get a lot of interest in people when they do interact with the police and they have something that they want to share. Our hope is that they'll know about this, or they'll know somebody who knows about this, and they'll say, you should share this here. But we lost momentum, and so that hasn't happened. There's even talk about doing another tribunal, but that's not really in the works or anything. We're just, at this point, it's just focusing on getting this right.
Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions?
Thank you so much for being here and taking the time out from all the things you're working on to speak to a room full of archivists. I was wondering, like, if you could talk about, like, because it's such an interesting model, and like what things like came out of it that were really done